The Vari fleet emerged from faster-than-light transition exactly 11.4 minutes before Earth's defense network registered the intrusion. On paper, it was a minor deviation, a rounding error in interstellar timing models. In reality, it was the difference between preparedness and annihilation. Earth's early warning systems had been calibrated for predictable FTL shear signatures, clean, repeatable, governed by physics humanity believed it understood. The Vari did not obey those assumptions. 17 warships materialized across near-Earth space like thoughts being inserted into reality, rather than objects traveling through it. No gradual approach, no warning flare, just presence. Each vessel was constructed from dark matter composites, engineered to bend detection around them until proximity made detection irrelevant. By the time any sensor acknowledged their existence, they were already inside optimal strike parameters, inside the kill zone. Each ship carried antimatter yields sufficient to fracture a moon, not as a threat, as doctrine. The formation held for a fraction of a second longer than comfort allowed. Then the fleet began to move. And somewhere on Earth, alarms that had never been designed to sound under real conditions finally learned what it meant to be too late. They came in a perfect wedge formation, a hunting pattern the Vari had used for 400 years, against species who never saw it coming, against civilizations that had taken thousands of years to build and were dismantled in hours. The Vari did not consider themselves conquerors. They considered themselves collectors. They had 43 species in their archive now, not enslaved, archived, digitized, compressed into neural lattices the size of a human fist. Their entire living populations reduced to data stored in a vault on a cold moon orbiting a dead star. Their planets, their resources, their infrastructure, all absorbed into the collective without so much as a diplomatic message. The Vari didn't negotiate. They simply arrived, they harvested, and they moved on. Earth was to be harvest number 44. The defense fleet scrambled. 9 ships freshly commissioned, their hulls barely broken in, their crews young and terrified and good. Admiral Yara Oe stood on the bridge of the UES Resolute and watched the tactical display with eyes that did not blink, calculating odds that did not favor her people. 9 against 17. And the Vari ships were bigger, faster, and older in the ways that mattered. Older in experience, in war, in the engineered cruelty of their weapons. All ships combat formation, she said. Her voice was steady. It was the steadiest thing in the room. The comm channels lit up. 12 civilian vessels trying to flee the outer belt. A colony station on Ganymede, broadcasting a distress signal on every frequency. The Mars garrison requesting orders it already knew it wouldn't survive following, and then cutting through all of it. A single transmission on a frequency that hadn't been used in 22 years. A voice old, dry as desert rock, carrying the quiet weight of something that had been waiting a very long time. Uses fleet command. This is the UES Tyrant's Bane. Hull designation GX001. I am activating under Emergency Protocol 7. Please confirm. Are we at war? Admiral Oakway turned to her communications officer. Her communications officer turned to her. Neither of them spoke for 2 full seconds because the Tyrant's Bane was not supposed to be here. The Tyrant's Bane was supposed to be drifting in a decommissioning yard near Pluto, stripped of her weapons, her engines cold, her crew long since reassigned. She had been Earth's first interstellar warship commissioned 78 years ago, retrofitted 7 times, crewed by legends and grievers and survivors of 3 different wars. She was old, she was obsolete. She was made of technology that military engineers now studied in museums. She was also, at this precise moment, moving, not drifting, moving, under power. Her drive signature bloomed on the tactical display like a sunrise, ancient and unmistakable, and completely impossible. Burning hard on an intercept course with the Vari fleet, Admiral Osei opened the channel. Tyrant's Bane. This is Fleet Admiral Oe. Confirm your crew manifest and status. A pause. Admiral, I have a crew of 1. My status is motivated. His name was Commander Ezra Mack, and he was 71 years old, and he had been sleeping on the Tyrant's Bane for 3 years. Not sleeping as a metaphor. Actually sleeping, living aboard her in the decommissioning yard in the old crew quarters, where he'd spent 40 years of his life in a bunk that still had the outline of his body worn into the mattress. He had refused to leave when the Navy decommissioned her. The Navy had threatened legal action. Then they'd threatened to physically remove him. Then they'd looked at his service record, at the 3 wars and the 47 engagements, and the Medal of Earth's valor he wore like a scar, and they decided that the paperwork to remove one stubborn old man from a dead ship wasn't worth the fight. He paid a nominal docking fee. He collected his pension. He maintained the tyrant's bane the way another man might tend a garden, walking her corridors every morning, running diagnostics that no one would ever see, keeping her systems alive when every regulation said they should be shut down. People in the decommissioning yard called him the Ghost. He didn't mind. He'd been called worse. His full name was Ezra Jin Woo Mack, formerly of Seoul, formerly of the UES Dawnhammer, formerly of the UES Perseverance, and for the last 4 decades of the tyrant's bane herself, the ship he'd served on as an Enin, as a lieutenant, as her executive officer, and finally, as her commander for 19 years. The ship he'd taken into the Kepler corridor skirmishes and brought back whole. The ship that had held the line at Proxima Station when the Draxi Confederation had tried to burn the outer colonies. The ship that had seen things that weren't in any official history, that carried scars in her hull that had been repaired so many times. The repairs themselves had scars. She was old. She was his, and he had known with the certainty of a man who has spent too many years studying war to be surprised by it, that humanity's peaceful decade would not last. He had used those years well. While the Navy's new fleet was being built with fresh doctrine, fresh weapons, fresh confidence, Ezra Mack had been quietly, methodically, illegally retrofitting the tyrant's bane. Not with anything flashy, with things that worked. He'd called in 40 years of favors, engineers who owed him, weapons designers who respected him, former crew members who couldn't say no to him. They'd come in small groups, quiet, unofficially, and they had worked. The drives were rebuilt, not with modern technology, with something older and stranger, a resonance system, based on Draxi-captured tech from the Proxima War, that the Navy had shelved because it was too unpredictable. The weapons had been recalibrated, stripped of their museum-quality mounts, and rearmed with a hybrid system that combined conventional railgun technology with gravitational shear emitters that Ezra had spent 6 years designing in his bunk using a salvaged engineering terminal. The hull had been the hardest part. The Tyrant's Bane was built from early-generation titanium ceramic composite, nowhere near the modern armor on the new fleet ships. But Ezra had studied the Vayari. He'd spent 3 years studying them when the first intelligence reports started coming in. When the patterns became clear to anyone who knew how to read them, he'd studied their weapons, their targeting systems, their known engagements with the K, with the Solari, with the Vaughn. He'd studied what they hit and how they hit it. And then he'd rebuilt the Tyrant's Bane's hull, not to be the toughest target, but to be the wrongest target. Layered with reactive composites and scattered array baffles that would make her look to Vari targeting systems like sensor debris, like space garbage. He had not told anyone about any of this. He was 71 years old. His knees hurt, and he had the patience of a man who understood that some things cannot be rushed. When the Vehari fleet dropped out of FTL, Ezra Mack was sitting in the Tyrant's Bane's command chair, eating a bowl of rice congee, with the navigation display open beside him. He had been watching their approach vector for 6 hours, from the moment the deep-range sensors he'd illegally patched into the fleet network had flagged their FTL signature. He set down his bowl. He cracked his knuckles. He pressed the ignition sequence he'd had memorized for 3 years. The Tyrant's Bane came alive. Not slowly, not the grinding, reluctant resurrection of an old machine. She came alive the way a predator comes alive when prey enters the clearing. Instantly, totally, with the focused readiness of something that had been waiting, and was finished waiting. The resonance drive spun up with a sound like the lowest note on an organ, a vibration that moved through the hull and through the deck and into Ezra's bones, where it felt absurdly like coming home. He opened the comms channel to Fleet Command. He confirmed yes. He had a crew of 1. He confirmed yes. He was moving to intercept. He confirmed no. He was not going to turn around. Admiral Owei's voice came back, stripped of protocol for just one moment, just one beat of pure human honesty. "Ezra, you'll die, Admiral," he said, settling into his command chair with the ease of a man sitting down to a familiar task. "I've been dying on this ship for 40 years. Least I can do is make it mean something." He cut the channel. He focused on the tactical display. He looked at the 17 Vari warships cutting through the dark toward everything he'd ever fought for. He did not feel fear. He felt something quieter and more dangerous than fear. He felt ready. The Vari Harvest Commander's name, translated into human fawns, was something like Vethgarith, and he had overseen the compression of 11 species in his career, and had never lost a ship doing it. He watched the human fleet scramble on his tactical display, and felt the particular kind of contempt that comes not from hatred, but from expertise. He had seen this before. The desperate formation, the comms spiking as command, tried to coordinate ships whose crews were too young to know what they were facing. The humans were brave, he noted clinically. They always were. The young ones. Bravery was common in species that hadn't yet understood what the collective was. Understanding came later. Understanding always came during compression. He registered the Tyrant's Bane when she broke from the decommissioning yard. His tactical system flagged her as a low-priority anomaly. An old vessel, outdated drive signature, hull readings inconsistent. Probably a derelict that had come loose from its moorings. He assigned one ship, the Vithkar, to intercept and neutralize, and returned his attention to the main fleet. That was his mistake. He would have time later in the compressed silence of the archive to understand exactly how large a mistake it was. The Vithar moved to intercept the Tyrant's Bane at 60% thrust, enough to destroy a derelict, far more than enough to destroy an old human warship. Her commander, Sorath Min, a decorated officer with 30 engagements on his record, targeted the old ship with a standard harvest suppression spread. 3 anti-adder lances, staggered for maximum coverage. The Tyrant's Bane wasn't where the lances expected her to be. She had moved, not away, sideways. A lateral burn that no ship of her apparent age and mass should have been capable of. Tight and violent and completely precise. And then she had done something Saruman's tactical system took 0.3 seconds to understand, which in combat was a geological age. She had fired first, not with anything the Vayari recognized as a weapon. The gravitational shear emitters that Ezra had spent 6 years designing, fired in a tight, focused sequence that didn't try to pierce the Vathar's armor. It grabbed the Vathkar's drive section and twisted. Not enough to destroy it, just enough to introduce a 4.7-degree misalignment in the drive field. The kind of misalignment that at the speeds the Vathar was traveling would take approximately 90 seconds to cascade into a catastrophic drive collapse. In those 90 seconds before Sarathman's crew could respond, before they could compensate, before they could do anything but realize what was happening to them, the Tyrant's Bane was already gone, burning hard on an oblique approach to the main Vari fleet, using the Vithkar's wreckage to be as a sensor shadow to mask her approach. The Vathkar died at 90.3 seconds, exactly as calculated. Ezra Mack did not watch it die. He was already busy. The human fleet had engaged the main Vari formation by then. A desperate, gallant, mathematically unfavorable fight that Admiral Okar was somehow making work through pure tactical brilliance. Using the 9-ship formation as a fluid screen, rather than a fixed line, never letting the Vayari lock a targeting solution, trading space for time in a dance that was costing her ships, but costing the Vayari more than they'd expected. The Tyrant's Bane came in from below the ecliptic plane from the one vector Vethor hadn't covered, because his tactical doctrine 4 centuries old, never meaningfully challenged, hadn't needed to cover it. No species had ever approached a Vari fleet from below. The math didn't favor it. The angles were wrong. You'd be exposing yourself without a clear target solution. Unless you'd spent 3 years specifically designing a weapon that worked perfectly at those angles. The gravitational shear emitters were not meant to be ship killers. They were meant to be ship breakers. There was a difference that mattered enormously. A ship killer needed to pierce armor, needed to overcome shielding, needed brute force. A ship breaker needed only to find the structural resonance frequency of a target, the precise harmonic at which any constructed thing, no matter how well built, wanted to come apart, and then match it. Ezra had spent 3 years calculating the structural resonance frequencies of Vari ships from captured debris, from sensor readings of their FTL drives, from every fragment of data the intelligence community had, and several fragments it didn't know it had lost. He was confident in his math. The first sheer salvo hit the Vayhari Harvest Claw-class dreadnought Sorath Prime, the fleet command vessel, not in the hull, but in the engine coupling, the junction where the main drive connected to the power core, a connection that Vayhari engineering had refined over 4 centuries into something elegant and efficient, and as it turned out, vulnerable to a very specific kind of harmonic stress that it had never been designed to withstand, because nothing had ever tried to apply it. The Sorith Prime didn't explode, her engine couplings sheared, and her power core lost containment sequencing, and she went dark. Not destroyed, dead in space. Drifting. The Vari fleet, for the first time in 4 centuries of harvest operations, received a transmission they had no protocol for. A human voice, old and dry, cutting across all their frequencies with the calm certainty of a man who has just done the math and is satisfied with the results. Vari fleet, Ezra Max said, your command vessel is neutralized. Your targeting systems are currently recalibrating for a threat vector they've never processed. You have approximately 4 minutes before I've worked through your entire left flank. I am giving you the option to withdraw. Silence. Then Vithsarathal's voice through his ship's secondary command systems, composed cold, carrying the weight of a species that had never retreated. You are one ship. You are one old ship. We are the collective. We do not. I know what you are, Ezra said. I know what you've done to 43 civilizations. I know about the archives. I know about the cold moon. A longer silence. Then you know, Vetharathal said, that you cannot what I know, Ezra said, and now his voice had an edge to it. Quiet and very cold. Is that you came to the wrong planet? And I know that, because I've been waiting for you for 3 years, and I have had a great deal of time to make absolutely certain that when you came, you would understand exactly what that means. He fired again. The Vari fleet's left flank lost 3 ships in 90 seconds. Not destroyed. Not glorious kills. Just cold and dark and powerless, drifting out of formation. Their crews alive and helpless, and watching through portholes as the tyrant's bane moved through them like a surgeon's knife. Precise and unhurried, taking exactly what she aimed for. Nothing more. Admiral Owe, watching from the Resolute, didn't cheer. She pulled her fleet into a new formation, one that used the gaps the tyrant's bane was cutting as choke points, herding the remaining Vari ships into kill zones they didn't realize were kill zones. She had spent the last 10 minutes watching an old man teach the most advanced predator civilization in explored space what it felt like to be outthought. And she was adapting fast. The battle had shifted. It had shifted completely, and it had shifted fast. And the Vari harvest commander, who had overseen 11 successful harvests and never lost a ship, was for the first time in his life operating without a doctrine that fit the situation. He was improvising against a human who had been planning this specific fight for 3 years. It was not going to go well for him. The tyrant's bane took her first real hit, 32 minutes into the engagement. A Vari frigo, smaller, faster, more maneuverable than the dreadnoughts, had broken from the formation and come at her from an angle that Ezra's fire solution hadn't anticipated, burning at full thrust with a kamikaze commitment that suggested her captain understood they were losing and had decided to take something down with them. The antimatter lance caught the tyrant's bane along her port-aft quarter just below the secondary drive housing, and it was not a glancing blow. The explosion tore through 3 compartments. The secondary drive went offline. The hull breach sealed automatically. Ezra had upgraded the damage control systems too, one of the dozen quiet improvements that no one had known about. But the impact had shaken something loose in the gravitational shear array, and Ezra's tactical display suddenly had a gap in its fire solution, a 40-degree arc off the port side, where he had no effective weapons. He also had a fire in compartment 7. He was alone. There was no damage control crew. He pulled up the compartment 7 suppression system, triggered the automated halon release, confirmed the fire was contained, and returned his attention to the tactical display. His hands were shaking very slightly, not from fear, he thought, but from the adrenaline of a 71-year-old body doing things it was no longer designed to do. He breathed through it the way he'd breathed through it 40 years ago. In other battles, in other bad moments, the Vari were reorganizing. Vatsorathul was not a fool. He was a man with a bad doctrine, operating in a situation that doctrine hadn't prepared him for. But he was adapting slowly, and the adaptation was starting to show. The remaining 10 Vari ships, 7 operational, 3 neutralized and drifting, had pulled into a tighter formation, giving up the aggressive spread that Ezra had been exploiting, and were now moving as a consolidated unit, trying to use mass and firepower to compensate for their tactical confusion. It would work, Ezra calculated in approximately 12 more minutes. When they completed their reorganization and brought all weapons to bear on a coordinated target solution, The Tyrant's Bane, with her secondary drive offline and her port weapons array compromised, would not be able to maneuver out of their kill zone. He opened the fleet channel. "Admiral OA, I have a problem." Her voice came back immediately, crisp and controlled. "We see it. Tyrant's Bane, your port side is open. We're moving to cover." "Negative," he said. "I need you to stay with the formation. What I need from you is a distraction. Specifically, I need you to do something tactically irrational in the next 3 minutes." A pause, then with the tone of a woman who had been watching him work for the last half hour and had stopped being surprised. "How irrational?" "Charge them," Ezra said. "All 9 ships full thrust directly at their formation. Don't fire, just charge." Another pause. He could imagine her face. "They'll break formation to respond," he said. "They haven't been able to stop doing that. Every time something unexpected happens on their perimeter, they break formation. It's in their doctrine. 400 years of successful harvests means they've never had to develop discipline for a sustained defensive posture. When you charge, their right flank will peel out to intercept. That reopens the angle I've lost. I can end this in 6 minutes, Admiral. I just need 3. The longest pause yet. "Fleet. This is Admiral OA. Full thrust. All ships charge. The UES fleet. 9 ships battered, running on courage and stubbornness. And the particular human refusal to calculate odds when calculating odds means giving up. Burned hard towards 17 Vari warships at suicidal closing speed. They did not fire, they just came. It was insane. It was the kind of insane that 4 centuries of unopposed harvesting had not prepared the Vari for. VH Sorathul's tactical system had no response pattern for this. Because nothing had ever done this. Because nothing had ever needed to. His doctrine said, charge was a prelude to a weapon solution. His doctrine said, break and establish counter-argeting positions. His right flank broke. Ezra was already moving. The resonance drives, old, strange, built from technology everyone else had considered too unpredictable, pushed the Tyrant's Bane through the gap at an acceleration that made the hull groan, and the structural integrity system scream warnings that Ezra silenced with one hand while he fired with the other. The gravitational shear array, even with its portside gap, had a clear line to the Vari formation's exposed center, to the secondary command vessel that had taken the Sorath Prime's role, to the fleet coordination hub that was trying to manage the response to OA's charge, while also processing the Tyrant's Bane's reappearance on a new vector. It could not do both. No system could. Not in the 2 seconds Ezra gave it. He fired every emitter simultaneously. Not a surgical strike. A broad, sheer pulse. The kind of attack he'd been deliberately avoiding because it was wasteful and imprecise, and not how he liked to work. But precision was a luxury, and he was out of time. And this was what the moment needed. 4 Vari ships went dark in the same second. Their drive fields collapsed in a cascade, each one's failure destabilizing the next in the tight formation. A chain reaction that Ezra had been holding in reserve since the first hour of the battle, since before the battle, since 3 years ago when he'd first sketched the cascade geometry on a napkin in his bunk, and thought, yes, if I can ever get them close enough together, he'd needed them to think they were winning, he'd needed them to consolidate, he'd needed them scared, and reactive, and pulling tight. He'd gotten all 3. The Vayari fleet went from 10 functional ships to 6 in 4 seconds. The Tyrant's Bane came through the formation's heart like a wound, and Admiral OA's fleet came through the outside, and what had been a harvest became with horrible speed a rout. Vithsor broadcast his surrender on every frequency 6 minutes later. He did not use the word surrender. The Vayari had no exact word for it, no protocol that covered it, because they had never needed one. He used the word for cessation of collection activities, which was the closest thing in his language, and Ezra accepted it without comment, and the guns went quiet. The Tyrant's Bane hung in the black, her port side torn, her secondary drive dark, her hull scored by 3 additional hits she'd taken in the last minutes of the battle when she'd had no more room to be clever and had just had to endure. She was not whole, she was not undamaged, but she was still flying. Ezra Mack sat in his command chair in the silence after the gun stopped, and he looked at the tactical display with its pattern of dark Vari ships and living human ships, and he breathed. He was 71 years old. His hands had stopped shaking, his knees still hurt. He opened a channel to the 6 remaining Vari ships. "I want the archive coordinates," he said. All 43 of them. I want the compression keys, the lattice specs, and the restoration protocols. You have 60 seconds to decide whether you're going to give them to me. A silence that lasted 41 seconds. Then the data stream began. It took 4 years. 4 years of the most complex xenobiological project in human history, carried out in partnership with 17 species who had not known they still had partners, who had gone to sleep as compressed data, and woken up to find that a civilization they had never met had spent 4 years learning to read the code that held them. 43 species. Not all of them survived restoration intact. Compression had been cruel to some, and the oldest archives had degraded in ways that even the Vari restoration protocols couldn't fully address, but most did. Most came back. Some of them had been in the archive for 200 years. Some had been in it for 11. All of them emerged into a universe that was different from the one they'd left, but emerged alive, which was more than the Vayari had ever intended for them. Humanity did not ask for thanks. Humanity did not demand treaties or alliances or debt. The Terran Restoration Council, established specifically for the project, run by xenobiologists and ethicists and engineers, and former soldiers who understood what these people had endured, asked only one thing of each restored species: that they tell their story, that they let it be known what had happened to them, and what had happened to the Vari, so that the rest of the galaxy understood both. The galaxy was listening. It had been listening since the battle, since the transmission had gone out on 17 different frequencies simultaneously. The full record of the engagement, the tactical display, the comms, all of it, and spread through the stellar neighborhood faster than any official broadcast. Carried by traders and refugees, and curious civilizations who had been watching the Vari expand for decades, and had not known what to do about it. They knew now. They knew what one old ship had done. They knew what one stubborn old man had built in his bunk in a decommissioning yard. They knew what humanity had brought to the fight. And they knew this, perhaps most importantly, that humanity had won not by being stronger or faster or better armed, but by being patient, by thinking further ahead, by understanding the enemy well enough to build the exact thing the enemy could not handle, and then waiting quietly for the enemy to arrive. The Vari were not destroyed. They were tried brains by a tribunal that included representatives of all 43 restored species, with human advocates and Vari defenders, in proceedings that lasted 2 years, and resulted in a sentence that the Vari themselves had no framework for restitution. They were assigned collectively as protectors and rebuilders of every world they had harvested, their ships, their technology, their vast engineering capacity, all redirected to the work of undoing what they had done. It would take generations. The tribunal intended that. Making it last was the point. Ezra Mack was not present at the tribunal. He was present for the first restoration, a species called the K, the second most recently compressed, whose world was a blue-green planet, not entirely unlike Earth, at a particular angle of light. He stood at the edge of the landing field on the Tyrant's Bane's boarding ramp. His ship had been repaired over his objections, and then officially recommissioned over his objections, because the Navy had decided that some things were not permitted to be scrapped. And he watched the first Cath emerge, blinking into sunlight that had waited for them. An old woman that was the first one out, old by Caith standards, which was not entirely unlike old by human standards. She stood in the sun for a long time without moving. Then she turned and looked at the ship, and at the old man standing on its ramp, and whatever Cath faces did, when they meant what human faces meant. When a person was trying very hard not to show something, she did that. Someone had taught her some English. Not much. Enough. You are the one, she said, from the old ship. Ezra nodded. She looked at the Tyrant's Bane, at her repaired hull, her new markings, the battle scars that no one had fully smoothed away because the ship's new crew had voted unanimously to keep them. She looked at her for a long time. We were told, she said slowly, that you were supposed to be retired. Ezra looked back at his ship, at the ship he'd lived on for 40 years, that he'd rebuilt in secret, that he'd taken into a fight that should have killed them both, at the ship that was against all reasonable expectations still here. We were, he said. The Keth elder looked at him. What changed your mind? Ezra was quiet for a moment. Behind him, the Tyrant's Bane's drives hummed at idle. That low organ note sound, the one that moved through the hull and into the bones, and felt even now like coming home. Turned out, he said, nobody else was going to do it. He stepped off the ramp. He walked into the sunlight. And behind him, the oldest warship in the human fleet stood in the light of a world that was alive again. Because someone had refused, stubbornly and completely, and without apology, to let it be otherwise. The galaxy had 43 new reasons to know humanity's name. It would not forget them. Neither would the Vari.